Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name is Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and today I'm talking The Great Hunt, Book 2 of The Wheel of Time. Looks like my cat's joining me for this video. So today I'm talking both my spoiler-free and spoiler-filled thoughts on The Great Hunt and how much I liked it and what were some of the things that worked for me, maybe some of the things that didn't. How does it hold up against the first book? This is my first read-through of The Wheel of Time, so all my knowledge of the series is only what's been said in books 1 and 2. And one thing which unfortunately was spoiled for me because of the stupid X-ray feature on Amazon Prime in the latest episode of the show, I think episode 7. But besides that, I'm just giving my thoughts with the context of book 1 and 2, and just be warned that for the non-spoiler part of my Great Hunt discussion, I probably will be throwing around some spoilers of The Eye of the World, just so you can understand where I'm coming from with some of my thoughts about book 2 that only really would make sense in the light of some of the events from book 1. So let's get into it. So The Great Hunt is book 2 of The Wheel of Time and picks up pretty close after the events of book 1, The Eye of the World. It's been about a month or so after the climactic events in The Blight, and the main characters find themselves back at the fortress city of Fal Dara, completely changed by the events of the first book, and starting in with the main character Rand al'Thor's perspective, who was revealed to us at the end of book 1 was the Dragon Reborn. And some of the other characters are coming into themselves a little bit more, understanding what change they went through in the first book. But a lot of that is upended when there's an attack on the city of Fal Dara, and the main characters, or at least some of them, go on a chase to recover something that was stolen in that attack. And that's as far as I'll give you for the premise of The Great Hunt, but besides that, I'll be spoiler free until I get to the spoiler section. So what did I think of The Great Hunt? Well, I really liked it. I honestly can't decide whether or not I like this book or The Eye of the World more. I think as of the first half of The Great Hunt, when I was reading it, I wasn't enjoying it as much as the first book, but because of the crazy second half, and especially the way the final act ramped up so much, I really can't decide which one I like more. This one I think was definitely faster paced, I'll give it that. Not to say I didn't enjoy the pacing of the first book, I actually really enjoyed the way it took its time to build everything up and get us really established in the main characters and their home life at Emond's Field. There were some spots in the first book, sure, that dragged a little bit, especially towards the middle when the group of characters was split, but The Great Hunt was from start to finish really fast paced. And something that I like that it did a bit better here was that the goal of the story was pretty much the same from beginning to end. There was one goal in mind, something they had to do, and they were accomplishing that, or attempting to accomplish that, throughout most of the story. In The Eye of the World, the goal seemed to be shifting a little bit, and what they had to accomplish was changing. So I liked in this book that from start to finish, they needed to do this one thing, and that's where the story was inevitably headed. So yeah, the first half of this book, although it didn't feel slow, to me it felt a bit lower stakes. I wasn't as invested in what was going on and the stakes that the characters were being put through. I thought that their objective wasn't necessarily as important as what was going on in book 1, but as the story progressed, that changed and the stakes got super high and super dramatic. And overall, something I think this book really did well for me was the kind of more oppressive, dangerous tone that it set compared to the first book. There were some fun, adventurous scenes in the first one, which of course I enjoyed. I really like fun, adventurous books, but in this one, this world felt a little more threatening to the main characters, and some of these people were put through some crazy by the end of this book that was super horrific, and a lot of the characters were left on their own to solve their own problems. They didn't necessarily have a guiding hand like they did in the first part of book 1 to kind of lead them on this journey. And the goals that they had to accomplish in this book, they had to assume a bit more of leadership roles, and there were certain situations where people were going out with the thought that they had help in mind, but they really didn't have any and were left on their own, and they had to react to that in a way that I thought was really interesting to see. And in terms of those characters, I don't think there's necessarily as much development across the board for all of these characters that we're following as there was in the first book, but the development we do get specifically for Rand and a bit for Nynaeve and Egwene was really effective, and probably more effective than the development across the board we got in the first one. Rand especially, I think, had the most time dedicated to him in terms of his development and the most insight into the changes he was going through and the decisions he had to make. I do wish though that I saw a bit more of some of the characters that we had grown to appreciate and admire in the first book book. There are some major characters in this book that were barely in it, and I was not necessarily disappointed, but just kind of wished that they were a bit more involved. And of course there's going to be plenty of time to spend with some of these characters over the course of however many books are left in this series. There's a lot of time left, so it didn't bother me that much, but I wish some characters had been a bit more involved in this story. But these books are doing a good job of really endearing me to these protagonists. I'm already so invested in a lot of these protagonists, even though it's only book 2. I'm so hooked on their journeys and where they're gonna go. I'm very curious to see how they're gonna grow from here, and nothing bad better happen to any of them because I just admire them and care about them too much at this point. One thing actually that this book did really well, that it improved on over the first one quite a bit, it was one of the drawbacks for me in the first book, was how kind of silly, ineffective, and kind of incompetent a lot of the bad guys were in the first book, but in book 2 they feel a lot more dangerous, a lot more scary and threatening, and more effective as antagonists, I think. And speaking specifically about the Eye of the World, besides the kind of first act where we got introduced to the Trollocs and the Fades and stuff at Emond's Field, that was pretty scary, but past that, and maybe past Shadar Logoth, I felt a drop in kind of how threatening those villains were, and especially Baal Zaman and the Forsaken, who just kind of showed up at the end and were easily dispatched. I didn't think they were very threatening at all when they showed up on the page. I was like, oh, it's Baal Zaman again. He's just gonna, you know, talk to Rand about coming over to the dark side for the 5th time. Like, these guys are supposed to be these world-ending big bads, and whenever Baal Zaman shows up, like, he's the equivalent to me of like a Scooby-Doo villain. And then when the Forsaken showed up, they're like, oh, it's the Forsaken, what are we gonna do? And then they die like 3 pages later, and I was like, okay, these are supposed to be like some of the biggest antagonists of the series. But in this book, the Shadow Spawn felt way less silly, and there was a new antagonist that was sort of leading the Shadow Spawn that I thought was a really interesting villain, really effective, and somebody who was scary and a little bit more mysterious than what was happening in the first book. And besides the Shadow Spawn, there were antagonists that were even more effective than them. I don't want to give anything away, but there's an antagonizing force in this book that I thought was super effective, and they were super cool in a literary way, not necessarily in an actual human way. These are terrible people, but I thought they were so effective on the page and created such great danger for our characters to go through in a way that the previous antagonist couldn't do. Something else I really appreciated about this book was learning a lot more about the world itself, and not necessarily just in a geographic sense, but the cultures within, learning way more about the Aes Sedai and clearing up a bunch of stuff about them, and getting into some cultures and learning more about them that were alluded to in the first book, but not necessarily shown on the page. But I thought that when we encountered some of these cultures and people in book 2, that they just came right out of the book. They were so alive and so vibrant, and their culture was so rich and deep without being super backstory or exposition heavy for me. And again, like the first book, the locations here are so unique and fleshed out. There's a city we go to in this book, but it's so different from the city we went to in book 1, Caemlyn. These two cities are so distinctly different, and this one has its own really carved out identity. And I really appreciate that Robert Jordan, even though he's crafting 2 cities within the same universe, the same world, that he can make them so identifiable and so different in a second or 1 line on a page. I think that the locations are probably one of the true strengths of the series at this point, and something that I look forward to every time I get to a new chapter, and something I'm definitely looking forward to learning more about. New places, new cultures going forward in the series. Alright, so that's it for my spoiler-free part of the review. From now on, it's going to be spoiler-filled for book 2, The Great Hunt. I will put a tag up on screen to show where you can skip to if you don't want to be spoiled by anything and just want to get to my wrap-up at the end. But from now on, be warned, it's all spoilers from here. So now that I can talk spoilers, I'm gonna go right into just talking about the end of the book, because there's a lot to kind of break down there. So in the first book, one of the things I mentioned that the ending of The Eye of the World felt a bit rushed. Not necessarily to the point where it really bothered me, but I thought in book 2 there was really a big improvement on that, and much of a bigger ramp up and setting up of expectations for the ending. The entire last act of this book, when the Aes Sedai in training go through the ways with Liandrin, who's Black Aja, I mean, that was pretty obvious. They end up at Tommen Head, and Egwene is captured, and that whole thing was one of the most horrific things I've read. That was just such a debasement of humanity. It was awful. And then Rand and the hunting party getting teleported there, and all the setup around Falme, whatever the city's called, and the Shan-Chan there, that whole sequence of then trying to steal the horn and the dagger, and then the girls breaking Egwene out, and then the battle at the end was just a step up from the first book for sure, and super epic and explosive. Specifically the one part when finally they blow the horn and the heroes of legend come down to help them, and Arthur Hawkwing is one of them, and Perrin puts the dragon banner on a big stick and hoists it up, and they ride into battle with the dragon banner. That was such a great moment and something that was so built up for me, and I got chills reading that part because just picturing that in my head was so cool, especially after Rand's flip-flopping on the whole dragon thing for the entire book. And speaking of Rand, like I mentioned before, his whole thing about his character development being the most developed and seeing his leveling up over the course of this book is really cool to see, and him having been put in a leadership position when they went into that alternate world and it was just him and Hurin and Loial and then Selene, him having to really put on the leadership boots and ease himself more into the role of probably what's to come for him being the dragon. It was something I really like to see. But something that's been confusing me about Rand being the Dragon Reborn and being able to channel was that, okay, we know at this point men who channel will eventually go crazy, and we saw in the prologue of The Eye of the World that even Lews Therin, the dragon, went crazy using the power. So why are the Aes Sedai, who know he's the Dragon Reborn, making him try to channel? Why is Moraine in the Amyrlin Seat and Verin trying to push him to channel when we know that he'll eventually go crazy? Is there something I'm missing there, or is it something I just need to be patient about? Because at this point it seems like, yeah, he's the dragon, we want to use him to our purposes and to maybe save the world, but wouldn't he go crazy before he has the opportunity to do that? I'm a little confused there. And one scene that quite didn't work for me, although I appreciate it was a cool scene, you know, it was kind of effective, was Rand fighting the other Blade Master, the Seanchan one. And I don't feel like at this point Rand could have realistically beat this guy. He only started training with the Heraldmark sword a couple of months ago, and he only really received it a few months before that. But the fact that he beat this Seanchan Swordmaster right away was a little too much for me. Unless I missed something in that scene, I know he was using the Void a little bit, but I don't think he was channeling when it happened, so maybe I just missed something, but as it stands right now, it didn't quite work for me. One thing I wanted to mention, and this was a prediction I had that was completely untrue by the end of the book, was that I thought Egwene was totally gonna die. The whole thing about 5 riding forth and 4 coming back, I thought they were referring to the 5 kids from Emond's Field. And then there was that whole part at the beginning when they're still in Faldara and Rand and Egwene were like, oh, this might be the last time we see each other. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe they're leaning into the fact that Egwene's gonna die. And then the whole thing with Min reading the people at the White Tower, and then when she gets to Egwene is super vague and weird about it. I thought she might have seen her dying, but in the end that didn't happen. And one thing that confused me a little bit in this book, and hopefully one of you can clear this up for me, was that I thought the Lanfear reveal was super obvious, and I don't know if it was supposed to be played as a mystery until the point it was revealed in the last few pages. But from the get-go, the second I met Selene, I was like, okay, this is probably Lanfear. What other sketchy, you know, lady who's tempting Rand to do weird stuff have we talked about in this book? Like, she did not do a good job of trying to get on his side and protecting her identity. She was super sketchy and weird the whole time. So from the get-go, that was pretty obvious for me. And in the podcast I was listening to, The Wheel Weaves, Danny, one of the hosts, was really insisting the whole time that it was Lanfear, and she felt so validated. It was so funny when the reveal came true. And I felt the same way. I thought it was obvious. This reminded me of some Lovecraft stories that I've read where the twist or the conceit of the whole thing has been obvious from the get-go. But let me know if it was supposed to be obvious or if this was just kind of a poorly done mystery. And like I mentioned before, it was also pretty obvious that Liandrin was a bad guy. She was the most obvious suspect to be Black Aja. She was just mean the whole time and was torturing the lady at Faldara, and I was like, okay, this is super awful. No Aes Sedai should be doing this. She's probably the Black Aja. And yeah, of course she was in the end. But something that definitely wasn't obvious for me was Ingtar. Ingtar being a dark friend took me by surprise so much. I really was not expecting that. That scene made me really sad when he reveals that he was a dark friend who let the assassin into Faldara and probably let Padan Fain out. That whole thing made me so sad. He was so intent on getting the horn back to be his salvation, and he achieved it, and he was able to help the boys get out and buy them some time by sacrificing himself, which was really tragic, but also really effective, and definitely a twist I didn't see coming. And the scene earlier on when they find those alleged dark friends from Faldara, where he insists on doing the burial rites for them, even though everyone suspected that they were dark friends, in the light of this new information of him being a dark friend who was struggling with his own salvation, was really effective and also a lot more tragic. Speaking of dark friends and the Shadow Spawn and the dark side, let's talk about the bad guys. So like I mentioned before, I'm not the biggest fan of Baalzamon. I don't think he's very effective as a villain. He has very kind of weak, you know, Dark Lord vibes where he just wants to do evil and convert people to the dark side. And we've seen that a million times before, and there's nothing really interesting on his spin of things. Seems a little mustache twirly to me, and he's always harping the same point over and over again. We essentially have the same conflict with him and Rand at the end of the first book and at the end of this one, although the outcome hopefully is a bit different this time, but it was a very similar conflict, and he was just harping on the same points again, even though Rand at that point was like, nah, I'm not gonna come over to the dark side, just stop asking me. So hopefully that's either improved on in the following books, or maybe more details come out that make it a little more interesting to me, but as of right now, Baalzamon is definitely not my favorite. Something that is my favorite though from this book was the Seanchan. These guys are awesome in a totally scary, terrifying, horrific, human rights abusing way. I hate them as people. They're awful, awful people, but love them as antagonists. These guys were so intimidating and set up such a nice, refreshing thrill for me, especially coming off of how silly some of the Shadow Spawn feels sometimes. The whole Suldam and Damane thing was so demeaning and such an abuse of humanity, and especially to have Egwene go through that was just so disgusting. And I was so happy when they broke her out at the end, she got back at her Suldam. And the way her Suldam would treat her like a little puppy and even gave her the name of a little kitten she used to have was just so demeaning. It made my skin crawl, but it was so effective as a storytelling device. And these guys, the Seanchan, there's so much depth and history to them right from the get-go. They have this huge, deep history, and I thought that at this point at book 2, having the mystery revealed of what's across the Aryth Ocean might have been too soon. Maybe that was a mystery you want to hold on to for a little while longer, but I thought that the Seanchan were so effective that, yeah, give me all that stuff from across the Aryth Ocean. I want to learn much more about them. And the fact that Arthur Hawkwing rode against them in the final battle and them claiming to be the descendants of his armies that went across the ocean is something I really hope that the story touches upon going forward, because that's a huge thing. If they see essentially their god, the person that created their entire culture, riding after them thousands of years later against them in battle, what's that going to do to their whole identity as a culture? I really hope that they touch on this in the future. And the location of Falme, whatever it is, was so fleshed out, just like the other locations. I didn't mention them before, but specifically the Ogier setting, Cairhien, and the whole Days Day Mar thing, the Game of Houses, made it so rich and intriguing to me. And the way Rand the whole time was insisting he wasn't playing, but people thought he was playing really smartly by saying he wasn't playing, was really funny, and it ended up affecting the story in super interesting ways. And lastly, a character I wanted to talk about before I end off is Moiraine. So Moiraine was, you know, kind of the Gandalf Dumbledore figure of the first book, and in book 2 she's really proving that she's fitting in well to that Dumbledore role because she's pulling some real Dumbledore shit. You know, she drags them out of Emond's Field, puts them on this super dangerous adventure, you know, is there at Fel Dara in the second book, but is totally ignoring Rand the whole time, kind of like a certain wizard headmaster, and then screws off to do God knows what, looking at prophecies of the Dragon Reborn and the Horn of Valyr and stuff. Doesn't show up for 90% of this book, and then has the gall at the end to act like she helped and is mad at Rand. And I was like, what are you doing? And I was especially missing Lan too. Lan's a character I really, really like, and I was really missing his presence in this book. He was only there for a handful of scenes. Although I'm really liking his and Rand's relationship developing a bit more, he's kind of taking on a bit of a mentor figure to him, and I hope that's developed a bit more because I really enjoyed those interactions with them too. So that's it for my review of The Great Hunt. I really enjoyed this book overall, and I was super excited to get into book 3, although I'm going to pace myself. I'm going to wait until January to start reading that. Maybe that'll be the first book I start off in 2022. But overall, it was fun. It was a wild ride. It was super fast, and I enjoyed it from start to finish for sure. So in the comments, let me know if you've read The Great Hunt. What did you think of it? Did you like it more or less than The Eye of the World? Or were you a bit more mixed on it and had some complaints? I know for sure I had some complaints. They weren't necessarily story-breaking ones for me, just kind of minor nitpicks. But overall, a great book. And The Wheel of Time thus far is proving to be a series that I'm really enjoying and I'm becoming very quickly invested in. So before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. That really helps. And as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.